probably, of all the topics you can possibly talk about when it comes to lifting and getting results, is understanding the concept of training to failure. If you don't, it's going to screw up almost every single lift that you do in the gym. So let's get this straight today. I'm going to show you examples and demonstrations. We're going to take you through it because there's a lot of context here. Yeah. This is not a simple just this, or train to failure or don't train to failure.
It's not black and white.
No, and a lot of times people try to boil it down to that. You're going to see there's a whole hell of a lot of context behind it, starting right off the bat of what are you training for?
Whether it's strength or hypertrophy.
Exactly. If you're training for strength, this isn't really part of the discussion.
Right.
Right? Because the idea of training for strength is that we're talking about successfully completed reps. High effort potentially, if you're maxing out, but they're effort on successful repetitions.
Yeah.
I think one of the keys behind training to failure is unsuccessful attempts.
Okay.
Training to the point where you cannot complete a repetition.
Yeah.
If we're going to talk about creating muscle growth, understanding what failure is so critical, and defining it in a specific way is critical because there's multiple ways to define it. Let me talk about a few of them. The first would be form failure. And by the way, we program failure differently at different times because it matters. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Form failure would be completing a repetition on an exercise exactly as is prescribed through the same form. Yeah. Now, grinding through a repetition, this may be the most, zoom in on me here, grinding through a repetition so that it goes slow does not indicate a form breakdown. Unless you're training for power here, if the speed slows down but it's still the same repetition and your goal is hypertrophy, a grinder of a repetition is not an indicator of form breakdown. Therefore, you need to train through the grind in order to reach that point of potentially the next level of failure, which could be mechanical failure. Yeah. In other words, not being able to move the weight anymore. Okay, now we could take it even further because people don't sometimes just train to concentric failure, they also could train beyond that. Okay. They could train to isometric failure, right, or they could train to eccentric failure, where you can literally cheat your way through the concentric portion of the rep just so that you have another attempt at a much stronger eccentric overload until that can't even be controlled anymore. In other words, if you were doing a bench press, someone helps you lift the bar off your chest, and now your goal is just to lower it slowly. Again, that's a method of failure, and it does drive incredible gains, but it's incredibly intense, and that can't be done all that often. So you have to make sure that you're defining failure properly. So the best way to do this, I thought, was to take some examples of what it actually would look like. And here, 3 important things come into play. Again, there's so many layers of context, but you need to understand these. The first thing you got to talk about is what's the major goal of the exercise? Is it a pull exercise?
Or a push
exercise? Is it a push exercise, or is it maybe even a leg exercise? Yeah. We'll talk about the differences. Number 2, what is the load that you're using? In other words, at what range are you going to likely not be able to perform another repetition? So is it heavy, so more in the 3, 4, 5 rep range? Yep. Is it more moderate, so in the 10, 11, 12 rep range, 8, 9, 10, in that range? Or is it a much higher rep range, let's say 15 plus, 18, 19, 20, somewhere around there? Because that's going to have a very different effect on what failure will look like for you, and we'll demonstrate again what that looks like. Or lastly, is it a compound exercise or an isolation exercise? Yeah. Because compound exercise and isolation actually have varying elements that actually play into how it looks. All right, so take me through what this heavier set is for you and why, or what you're feeling if you can.
Yeah, so this is a heavy set, so I'm obviously going to use a little more momentum than normal.
Yeah, I'll get back to that in a second too.
But the eccentric is a little bit slower.
You got to have eccentric control, I feel like.
And right here on rep 4, it hits me out of nowhere and it gets halfway down. And once I try my 5th rep, it doesn't even get a quarter way down. Right.
What's interesting here is these are really good illustrations for you to see because I'm sure you've felt these before. First of all, I mentioned a difference between pulling and pushing. Yeah. Pulling does almost always give you a little bit of an extra opportunity to use a little bit of momentum. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's bad. I think that's something that we can build into the exercises to help us to still perform good-looking repetitions. There's nothing wrong with that, but it gives us a chance to push that intensity up. Yeah. What was good was that the eccentric control was there, though. Mm-hmm. If you pull so much but you have no eccentric control, the weight's just too damn heavy. Yeah. You shouldn't be using that weight. That's not a good representative set.
You've made that point in previous videos before.
Right, so that was good. But what's really interesting, what failure looks like in this lower rep range is it comes pretty damn quick.
Yeah, it hit me like a ton of bricks like that.
Right, you almost had to convince yourself because you only got that half rep. You did a full rep, then a half rep, then you go for that additional rep almost to convince yourself. Yeah. So we call it like the rate of drop-off, right, or the rapidity of fatigue, how rapidly you reach fatigue.
Yeah.
And interestingly, it almost comes down to sort of just a math equation because there's only a few repetitions here to consider. You did 3 good repetitions, your 4th one was a half. Yeah. So if you're talking about 4 repetitions, there's only 3 inter-rep periods, right? So to go from 0% fatigue to 100% fatigue or failure, you're taking bigger chunks away from your capacity with each repetition. So there's not this sort of like gradation between repetitions that's as drawn out as it is when you start to introduce like lighter weights. Yeah. So you are going to feel like I did a good repetition and then all of a sudden whack, it's like I got hit with a ton of bricks. The other thing you'll notice here is you may be able to grind, but if you don't, again, once you reach that point of failure and fatigue, you can't get the weight. It's just sort of stuck, right? There's no grinding as you'll see here. Now, if we lighten the weight a little bit and we take you through another set, take me through this and what you're feeling here. So this is a little bit more like a 10 to 12 rep range.
Yeah, so this one was a lot easier. I didn't have to use as much momentum.
Right, more strict in the beginning, for sure.
Momentum.
Yeah.
And I was just seeing like the weight is not, it's in control on the way up. It's moving well on the way down. But as I start,
good.
As my reps start going forward, the amount of time that it takes me to go through the lowering of the weight takes a little bit longer because I'm reaching more fatigue. But I'm still able to keep going and still grind out a few reps.
That's not form breakdown.
No.
Okay, that's what we're calling grinding right here.
Yeah, and I'm able to get squeak out a few more reps because it's a lighter weight and it's not coming as fast, not hitting me like a ton of bricks like that.
And here comes the unsuccessful attempt. Here's where you convince yourself. This is failure. You convince yourself of an unsuccessful rep. Like you cannot do any more. You actually didn't have good eccentric control on the way back there. But if you were to rewind this just a little bit, if I were to take this back a few repetitions, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is where some people might quit, right? They might quit here because they're just thinking this is too much of a grind or this is form failure if that's what they're thinking. This is and they stop there. But you were able to get this one additional repetition. And usually that's what you see in this range is one additional repetition. But that one additional repetition and even this partial of this next repetition are incredible growth-inducing repetitions. Okay, now, I'm aware of the science that talks about 1 or 2 reps shy of failure may deliver almost as good a result as what happens by taking yourself all the way till failure. My contention with this, and this is what's so freaking important, if you don't know what failure is and you're gauging it off of the second to last repetition there, then you are not 2 reps shy of failure. You are 4 reps shy of failure. You are not getting the result. So I understand and appreciate the concept of training less than failure, but if you're screwing up what failure is and you're not experiencing what the real actual muscular failure is, then you're not accurately assessing where you're at. That's why it's so damn important to get this right. So now if we were to lighten the load additionally, it would look it looks something like what we just looked at, but you'd be able to do some more grinding. Let me show you a different exercise. This is me doing a straight arm push down. I'm jumping in. This is about, I think, like a 15 or 16 rep set. So I'm jumping in somewhere around 10, 11, or 12. Now, look at the grind here. If you look at the grind, you can see that it's still a straight arm push down.
Yeah, it's not in bad form at all.
No. And that is just really, really grinding. And in this repetition here, I'm still going because what's ironic about these higher rep sets is the tension is always sort of at a level that you can still push as long as you're willing to fight.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that last repetition is some might say that was a cheat, but look what happens here if I speed it up. I mean, it's still a straight arm push down.
It looks exactly like the
By the way, I think that was sped up like 1100% or something like that. But yes, it still looks like the exercise. And I'll go back one more time. This ability to fight through here, I think, is the #1 opportunity that you have right now in your higher rep sets because you always have the ability to grind a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more because the weight is light enough to allow you to do that. And there's been good research of late that shows that repetitions all the way up to the 30 range are capable of producing hypertrophy as much as it is at lower rep ranges. There's not as much of a differential anymore, as long as you're taking those repetitions all the way to failure. And that's what I'm talking about. That type of failure, that type of grind that a lot of people find very uncomfortable, especially beginners. You had an interesting thing about beginners. You actually didn't want to grind as a beginner. Why?
Well, for one, I thought it was a form breakdown.
Okay.
Two, it was an uncomfortable sensation, and I didn't think that if I was going to be that uncomfortable, I would be able to get another rep. I learned that, especially now, I can go past that point of...
Well, what about, you mentioned how when you were in the gym, you knew you were using lighter weights, and you didn't want to struggle.
No, because if I'm using lighter weights and I'm seeing everyone else, if I'm benching 135 and I'm struggling and I see other guys benching 315, I don't want to look like I'm struggling.
Right, so I understand the concept, guys. The only way you're going to start to improve your physique and get to the point where you feel more comfortable probably in your own skin is to build the muscle in the first place, and the prerequisite to get you there is to increase that effort level.
Yeah.
Again, you got to increase the effort level, and whether you're struggling with something that someone else is not struggling at all with doesn't really matter. It's you versus you at the gym. So now the push is different. And the reason why push is somewhat different is you don't have the momentum opportunities that you do on pull, right? You have the ability on a row to stand a little bit more upright to get the bar going, or on a curl to swing your body a little bit, right? Or on a lat pull down to swing your back a little bit, or lean back. When you're pushing, it's sort of you're there and it's you against the bar on the bottom of a bench press, and if you hit a sticking point and you can't get it going anymore, usually it's done. So you're going to have less cushion, and probably everything we just described is going to come a little faster. So here I am doing a push, which is going to do a dumbbell bench press. So this would be more of a heavy one for me. And you can see the first repetition here, you're moving pretty good. Second repetition, moving okay. Again, I don't know how many I'm going to fail at here. That was a little bit of a grind, but still doable. Now this one, all of a sudden, hits me pretty hard, and I'm grinding, and I'm grinding, and I'm grinding. Now it's rare that you can actually grind through a really heavy repetition. In other words, it's probably 50-50 that you're going to get that. But interestingly, if you do successfully grind through a really heavy repetition, here's a squat that you were doing where you're actually grinding through this repetition. And it's a grind.
Yeah, that is an absolute grind. That was everything.
That's the 430 squat you were talking about.
That's the 430.
Now, you're done. There's no additional rep coming after that happens. But again, what's most important is that it hit you quickly.
Yeah.
Okay? And it hit quickly here. Now, if we go here and we use a more moderate weight, here's what this looks like. So again, pushing wise, you should see some similarities between what Jesse did on the pull down and what I'm doing here. But everything is sort of moving, not a problem here. You can see the effort level. Wow, interestingly, we do this on Instagram, the watch me turn red right before your eyes.
You look like a tomato.
The tomato's in action right here. So you'll just see the color of my head as I'm pushing more and more and more. But now, people would stop there. They would stop there. This is grinding all the way through again. Okay? And again, not bad form. It's the same exercise. Now I got to convince myself. So this is an interesting thing if you want to try this. If you take yourself and you record yourself doing any exercise, and you take a tool like iMovie or some editing software like I'm doing right here. If I were to go through the same set that I'm doing for you here in real time, and you're watching me drop these little markers in, look what's happening to the spacing of the markers. They're getting further and further and further apart towards the end. Not because I'm resting more in between the repetitions, but because I'm actually grinding more through the repetition, but I'm pushing and I'm raising the effort level much higher in order to do this. If your first repetition looks exactly like the last repetition, you're likely getting it wrong. In other words, if your spacing remains the same through here, again, if you're training for power, that's amazing, right? That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to maintain and prevent that velocity drop off. But if you're training here for hypertrophy and your spacing doesn't change, it was too easy for you. You didn't push yourself hard enough.
And you didn't hit true failure.
Right. Now, if I were to take myself into a lightweight, you'll see here that if I'm going to go take this set, this again jumping in at maybe the 10 rep mark or something like that. I can't remember, 10 or 11 or 12. But the face is already tomato red. But I'm able to push and grind. See, because the absolute load is lower, the grinding is there for me if I'm willing to do it. And it's like push, 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 push. I almost get this. Almost. My left arm gives out a little bit.
Short arm it a little bit.
Right. But the fact is that I was able to do that. If you stopped a couple reps shy of that, even if I stopped right about here, it's a tough repetition. But meanwhile, I've got another rep in the tank, right? I've got another repetition, or at least almost 3/4 of a rep to go. I think you need to up the intensity of the effort every single time you can and convince yourself that you can't perform another repetition. The major idea here is to show you how this looks, because if you don't look like this right now, you are leaving a lot of gains. Again, I talked about that high rep range, especially in those moderate rep ranges, but what to expect is important for you to understand, because if you are screwing up the premise of an argument, then the whole argument sucks, right? So if you're screwing up the concept of failure in the first place, or if you're not defining it properly, I even see studies that are out there that talk about training to failure, but they don't say exactly what type of failure it was. They just say training to failure. And that's too arbitrary to have a lot of value.
Because there's so many different definitions of what failure is.
Like we talked about. But if you yourself in your own training are gauging some effort as your maximum effort, and then you're leaving your 2 in the tank if you so choose, or you're doing some percentage if you so choose, if the representative example is bad, then all the stuff that comes after that is skewed also. Right? It's not going to give you what you really need, and therefore your training is not going to deliver the results that you really need to get from it. So hopefully you guys found this helpful. If you are looking for a way to actually manipulate how and when the types of failure to train with, then you want to follow our ATHLEAN-X programs. You can find them over at ATHLEAN-X.com. In the meantime, if you haven't done so, make sure you click subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video when we put one out. All right, guys. See you soon.